Welcome to my note presentation. I am recording this video as of 9:56 p.m. on April 7th, 2026 in Michigan, where online sports gambling is legal. Right now, the Detroit Tigers are playing the Minnesota Twins at Target Field in Minneapolis. Currently, center fielder for the Detroit Tigers, Parker Meadows, is on deck. Now, if I wanted, before I even get to the next slide, and without a moment's hesitation, I could empty out my entire savings account and bet on the number of pitches that will be thrown in the at-bat, whether Meadows will get a hit, or will he strike out, or even the speed of the next pitch. The main crux of my note is that I should not be able to do this, that the ease with which people can now gamble has become excessive, that this ease has led to an increase in gambling addiction in the United States, and that Congress must step in to remedy these issues. I will walk through 5 parts. First, the post-Murphy landscape. Next, the nature and rise of gambling disorder. Third, the failure of the state and federal governments to remedy these issues. Fourth, my proposed legislation, and finally, an evaluation of prior congressional attempts to regulate the industry. President George H.W. Bush signed the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, or PASPA, into law in 1992. Now, in sum, the law functioned as a nationwide ban on sports betting, with some exceptions in certain states, but generally the law made it unlawful for governmental entities to inter alia authorize betting schemes based on professional or amateur athletic events. In 2018, the Supreme Court decided Murphy v. NCAA and struck down PASPA as violative of the anti-commandeering doctrine. The court held that PASPA unconstitutionally dictated what state legislatures could and could not do without any federal program to speak of. And this paved the way for states to legalize sports gambling, and they have responded. 30 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico now offer legalized online sports betting. A majority of Americans of betting age now live in legal sports betting markets. National sports wager totals have exploded from $5 billion in 2017 to $120 billion in 2023. Sportsbook app downloads are increasing as well, from 6 million to 33 million in 2019 to 2023. And signing up takes less than 2 minutes. In 2022 alone, operators spent more than $2 billion on advertising. So the result is that sports gambling has gone from an illegal taboo to the front and center of the American cultural consciousness. It is integrated into broadcasts, stadiums, and mobile apps. It is, by some accounts, America's most lucrative vice, and that vice has never been so accessible. Justice Alito's majority opinion in Murphy, however, did leave a crucial observation on the table. He said, quote, that Congress can regulate sports gambling directly, but if it elects not to do so, each state is free to act on its own. Congress has unequivocally elected not to act, and I contend that the states have not used their freedom wisely. Historically, where access to an extremely addictive vice increases, so does addiction to it. The National Council on Problem Gambling, or the NCPG, estimates that the risk of developing gambling disorder has increased by over 30% since Murphy. A landmark study from the Journal of the American Medical Association found that in the 73 months immediately following Murphy, there were approximately 6 to 7 million searches for gambling addiction help nationally, 23% greater than what was expected. Monthly calls to the National Problem Gambling Hotline are increasing by great margins as well. Gambling disorder generally is recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as a legitimate mental health issue, is a legitimate mental health condition. It's in the same category as substance abuse disorders. It's neurobiologically linked with depression, bipolar disorder, and suicidality. Studies show that gambling disorder carries the highest suicide rate of any addiction disorder. Roughly 1 in 2 sufferers will consider suicide, and 1 in 5 will attempt it. But what makes gambling disorder uniquely devastating compared to other substance abuse disorders is that it destroys health and finances simultaneously and on an unprecedented level. GD is linked to higher rates of bankruptcy, unemployment, and homelessness. And there's evidence that gambling online is uniquely addicting because of its easy access through smartphones, and that it specifically targets certain vulnerable populations, such as young men, the elderly, and veterans, for example. Now, research shows that the introduction of online sports betting in a state corresponds to an average credit score decline of 12.17 points, with significant increases in debt collection and loan delinquencies. Further, the phenomenon of chasing losses traps users in a vicious debt cycle. Chasing losses is when a user continues to gamble, often in larger amounts, to try and recover what was already lost. Now, all of this is compounded by the fact that a small minority of sports bettors are actually profitable. So overall, online sports gambling is uniquely addictive, uniquely easy, but also uniquely destructive. Based on my research, there has been only one congressional response to the issues discussed in my note. The 2026 Consolidated Appropriations Act did allocate some research funds to look into the recent rise in GD in members of the military and in veterans. But the act merely lists gambling addiction as a research subject, as an enumerated research subject. It doesn't actually guarantee or mandate that it be studied. Even the main proponent of the policy estimates that only about $7 million will go towards research. So there's no widespread, robust federal monitoring system, and there are no federal standards, period. Congress has given the states complete freedom in how they choose to regulate their industries. And how have they responded to that freedom? I contend not well. The NCPG has adopted 82 responsible gaming standards, completely reasonable standards, common sense. Of the 31 states studied, only 11 met only 10 to 24 of those 82. So you have a good chunk of states meeting barely any of these reasonable standards at all. The Center for Addiction Science, Policy, and Research grades states' laws in this area. Now, of legal online betting states, Massachusetts actually scored the highest grade at a 62%. West Virginia scored among the lowest at 9%, yet both states have shown pretty strong evidence that people are becoming more addicted to gambling since the legalization of online sports books. So, therefore, even those states with supposedly strict rules are not really doing enough to protect their residents. After a year-long investigation, the New York Times concluded that states have required few protections for consumers. They're dedicating minimal funds to combating addiction, and often they're actually turning to the gambling industry itself to shape regulations. One scholar described the situation as a, quote, regulatory race to the bottom. Thus far, in basically every state, the focus has been on establishing licensing requirements, although at this point ample time has passed for the states to have considered public health protections, if not have them actually implemented at the time of legalization. But the incentive structure is clear. States have latched onto sports wagering as a revenue source, a way to raise money without raising taxes in other areas. The profit motive makes meaningful reform at the state level unlikely. My legislation would prohibit private actors from offering online sports betting, with an exemption in states that meet 6 mandatory standards. Standard 1 is to raise the mandatory minimum betting age to 25. Young people are the most susceptible population, and 25 is an age at which the risk of developing gambling disorder decreases significantly, according to studies. The legislation would also require an in-person identification verification, just as is required for tobacco and alcohol. Standard 2 is the imposition of mandatory loss limits. Every bettor would have to set a loss limit at account creation. This directly targets that chasing losses behavior that we were discussing earlier. The loss limits must be mandatory. One study, for example, found that only 8% of bettors voluntarily set loss limits, so therefore these bettors will not opt in unless they're required to. Standard 3 is to track and exclude problem bettors. Some sports books actually currently do the opposite. They target problem bettors with promotions, offers, deals. Sports books should use behavioral markers such as rapid deposit spikes or chasing losses to identify at-risk users trigger cooling off periods, or even automatic exclusion for more serious cases. Standard 4 is a restriction on financial instruments on deposits for credit cards and government checks. Gambling on borrowed money or government assistance only ends up fueling further addiction and financial ruin. Debit cards and bank transfers only. Standard 5 is to ban proposition bets, parlay bets, and live in-game betting. These are the most addictive types of bets that sportsbooks offer. Parlay bets stack outcomes, exponentially increasing the risk. Proposition bets and live betting enable micro betting on individual events within a game, which shortens the lag between bet and reward. And scholars have identified this as the most dangerous feature of online gambling. Eliminating these closes a major on-ramp to GD. Standard 6 is to ban advertisements and promotions. Ads trigger relapse. Promotions exploit vulnerable users. And furthermore, the promotions are rarely risk-free, even though they usually claim to be. In terms of the advertisements, there's no meaningful way to prevent minors from seeing them. In the current promotional landscape, the current landscape of the advertising generally has been compared to the now outlawed cigarette promotions of a bygone era. It really should be treated the same way. Now, in addition to these standards, I propose raising the federal excise tax on gambling. It's currently at 0.25%. It should be more comparable to the levels for tobacco and alcohol. The revenue could be used for many different things, but it really should be used first and foremost for a national survey to track GD levels nationally. It could be modeled on those surveys used for tobacco and alcohol use. And that would give us a better way of identifying the severity of the issue. The money could also be used for state-level treatment grants, training for medical professionals, and public health campaigns. Now, although Congress has not passed anything, it has not been entirely silent. The Safe Bet Act, reintroduced in March 2025, is the most serious and public health-focused attempt. It would reinstate a general prohibition with a state opt-in exemption, like my legislation. It would also ban credit card deposits, establish a national self-exclusion list, and create a national gambling disorder survey to track levels, which would all be a strong start, but it does notably lack mandatory loss limits, bans on proposition and parlay bets, and advertising. The Sports Wagering Market Integrity Act of 2018 was more focused on game integrity than consumer protection. It addressed addiction, but only through federal surveillance by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is a relatively reasonable, modest proposal. Now, even this was described as a non-starter by the American Gaming Association, representing the most prominent sports books. Finally, and most recently, the Points Act would create a grant program for gambling disorder treatment at the state level, a genuinely useful tool, but it is purely reactionary. Without regulating sportsbook conduct, it's more of a bandage than a cure. Now, the Safe Bet Act and the SWMIA died in committee. There is still hope for the Points Act, though. These bills taken together show that legislative framework is buildable. The question is whether Congress will muster the will to actually pass it before these harms become impossible to ignore. Since Murphy, access to online sports gambling has exploded. Operators are generating unprecedented revenue, and the public health and financial consequences are accumulating quietly, but they are accumulating for those who are looking closely enough. States vary disparately in their protections, and even the best performing states are not doing enough. The incentive structure, furthermore, makes robust state reform unlikely. So Congress not only has the authority, but I argue the responsibility to act. The legislation I propose would make it harder to gamble recklessly, harder to develop gambling disorder, and harder for the industry to exploit the most vulnerable. Now, as put by Harry Levant, a leading scholar and policy advocate in this area, quote, "To take an addictive product like gambling and microbetting, deliver it at light speed with artificial intelligence, and then say to people, but now use this responsibly, it is wrong." Congress agrees it can regulate the industry. The question is whether it will. My note argues that it must, and the framework to do so is already within reach. Thank you.